Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today on Todos Santos, we're going to be expanding our little town here on the side of the bay. We'll be taking inspiration from this part of Catania, where there is a small industrial presence still remaining, although we're going to be making some alterations for the context of Todos Santos. But before we get to that, we need to go back in time, about 40 years. This area probably once looked like the town of Gatonia that we made last episode. It came to life around the industrial presence that lined the bay years ago, but now a lot of those businesses have left, and there's just a single grain mill remaining supporting this community. But of course, as all those jobs left, so did the people, and many of the houses were torn down. So now there's not much left of what this place used to look like. There have been many attempts to develop this area into something new, something more in line with the rest of Todos Santos, and something that will attract people from other parts of the city, of the island, to live here and work here. But of course, there are still people who live here who call this place home. So at least for now, this place is going to have the appearance that it's really two communities instead of one. So I think we should start with the main inspiration for this build, which is this grain mill. I found this part of the city pretty interesting, so I want to do a fairly close build, but it's not going to be a recreation. Like, I always feel the need to stress this. It's not a recreation. This is just taking inspiration and using bits and pieces, such as this really cool logo that's painted onto the grain mill itself, and implementing that in Todos Santos. I'll get more into the inspiration later, but first I wanted to get started on this grain mill build. So I'm using PO to try to figure out how I'm going to do this writing, because a problem I found is that a lot of assets like this use a tiled texture. So if you try to write text on it, the text is going to tile as well, which makes it a little difficult to write giant letters on a building. So I tried several different assets. None of them really worked because of this problem or because of just ugly textures. So what I ended up using was these always practical prefab house walls. They do tile, but I found that I could basically just put a single letter on each one, and then we'll just cover up the tiled portion with the next letter, if that makes any sense. So I went through this fairly tedious process of spelling out each letter one by one, and we're going to end up with Molinos de Gatonia. Because if I'm going to go to all the trouble of spelling this out letter by letter with PO, I wanted to use our custom town name instead of doing something more generic, or just using the real-life inspiration, which you saw earlier. So in the real-life area, which is actually technically in Guaynabo, which is a neighboring town to Catania, there is more industry here than we're going to build. In line with what we've been doing in the rest of Todos Santos, I wanted to emphasize the deindustrialization of this area. So we have the grain mill complex taking up this end of the dock, and then the other part of the dock is going to be, unfortunately, an abandoned industrial area. Although there are plenty of opportunities for detailing that, that's going to be pretty fun. Now, with that out of the way, what actually is going on here? So we have the central grain elevator that we decorated with the logo earlier. That's an asset by Evangeline. Really nice asset. I love this. I also added a number of shorter silos, which I imagine would just be for longer-term bulk storage. So they have some grain on hand, just for whatever reason that might come up. And then I'm using a medium Industries DLC warehouse. That would be the main grain mill building. That's where the work actually gets done. And then a small warehouse, which I assume would just be kind of a general storage area where they could store all the various supplies they'd need to run this place. Of course, the way this is connected up to the community is fairly important, so we have some bus stops right next to the mill, and I wanted to have parking right off the street, so instead of using the normal, sunken road that has a sidewalk on it, I wanted to just use this ground level roundabout road, which of course we're not using as a roundabout, just using it as a normal road, and having the parking right alongside that. And I end up really liking the final look once we get some cars parked along here. So we're going to detail up this front area, and then we'll move on to detailing the docks. So at the real life mill, there's parking right along the dock, which I thought was kind of intriguing. So I'm using this parking lot both for the parking functionality, of course, but also for the texture. I did this back when we did a little marina build back in like episode 30, something like that. So I wanted to do that same thing here. Now I had to adjust the length a little bit with PO, and when you raise the vertices up and down with PO here, it kind of darkens it, which I don't know, I think it actually looks kind of cool. It's kind of nice to have little accidents like that every once in a while. Now I also have these conveyor belts by Ronix, which I am clipping into the grain elevator. I don't actually know how this kind of delivery would work, but I'm just going to assume that the conveyor takes it from the boats into the grain elevator, so that's why I'm clipping that in there. And then just to make it look a little bit more industrial as it's sticking up out of the water here, we have these always useful pipeline props, which of course this isn't a pipeline at all, but I think it fits the look well enough. And then I'm using the same conveyor belts here to access the smaller silos from the grain elevator, and also to send the grain into the mill building itself. I didn't have a proper bulk goods boat at the time of this build, so I'm just using an oil tanker. I thought it looked close enough. Obviously it's not perfect, but I think there is a good one on the workshop, so I'm going to get that and replace this at some point. Same thing with the cranes. I didn't have the right cranes, so I'm just using construction site cranes. Also, we got some pretty bad flooding here, so I needed to suck up all that water. Obviously, it was a little bit too close to the water level, so I needed to take everything, raise it up just a little bit, so that that doesn't happen again. We have a little triangle of land here in between the waterfront park that we made last episode and the grain mill. So I thought maybe to represent some of the development that's happening here, we have an empty lot that's been prepared for some sort of development, and then a brand new ferry terminal that's going to hook up with one of our ferry lines. The city has 2 ferry lines currently. There's one that goes in between the old town and this town, which is based off of the San Juan ferry line. And then there's also another one that travels along the river, stops by the university and a couple other places. This one ends up connecting to the river line because the main way we're going to connect to the other line for this town is going to come somewhere else with a much bigger ferry terminal, but that's for another episode. I'm trying to make it so the ferries can make smooth turns, because I don't like it when these big boats do really, really sharp turns. That just doesn't seem very realistic. So I'm using almost like boat slip lanes so that the routes they take end up looking quite a bit more natural. Moving on to the abandoned side of the industrial docks. First of all, we need an entrance for this end of the grain mill. So we have that here. That gate is terrain conforming for some reason. I didn't know that, but I love this asset so much that I just had to shift it over just a little bit to get that to work, because I really wanted to fit that rusted gate in there. And then of course we have some remains of an industrial presence here. So we have one warehouse that's remaining. We're going to build an abandoned factory that's been stripped down just to the bare concrete foundation, and all the other details you might expect in this kind of area. Here's a view of the place we're taking inspiration from in Guaynabo. Now we're building at a bit of a different scale. There's a different story behind it, but in real life, the place on the right here is called Vietnam because there's just been so much disruption over time in attempts to have this land developed. Now, I didn't want to name this place Vietnam because I like to come up with my own names for this series and to make Todos Santos its own place. So I end up calling that neighborhood Nova Scotia because it was the first completely non-Caribbean place that I could think of. And this new gentrified neighborhood that has popped up in the other half of the neighborhood is called Sunrise Harbor. Now, the real-life inspiration for this is called Sunset Harbor, just like the City Skylines DLC, so I wanted to change it a little bit, again, for that reason and for the previous reasons that I stated. So yeah, I ended up going with Sunrise Harbor. But it's a new development with the same buildings copied and pasted everywhere. We're going to be doing some more detailing to those, but I just wanted to get a sense of scale and of layout to start. They have a adorable little roundabout at the entrance to their community with the usual details and a very pleasant looking acacia tree in the middle. So to detail these places up, I wanted to just make a template with these bright iron fences that I just think fit in pretty much any situation, get rid of all these undetailed ones, and then add some props, some potted plants, all the stuff you might expect from these kind of cookie cutter houses that are gonna come fully stocked with furniture and all that stuff. So they're all gonna look pretty much exactly the same from the outside. Obviously, you know, people are living here. They're gonna be used in different ways. They're gonna be different on the inside, but as far as the exterior details, they're all completely identical. As you might expect, this community is a gated community. Of course, a wall can only go so far in separating people, but you know, they've done their best on this side of the fence over here. I like to think that sometime in the near future, this place will be a little bit more well integrated with the rest of the neighborhood, and it'll be a little bit of a more connected place. But for now, they have this wall that's built up here. They also have a new parking lot, which should just be for visitors. I felt it was not right to make this kind of car-centric development without having an extra parking lot, in addition to all the on-street parking. That just seems fairly realistic. Of course, they would have some trees here. I tried to go in general for younger-looking trees, since this is meant to be a newer development, but you know, I don't have too many of those in my collection, so we just have some normal palm trees as well, and these black frosts, which I just think look really nice. Moving on to Nova Scotia. I really had to force myself to space these houses out more than I usually do, because I really like to do kind of more of a dense, tightly packed development like we saw last episode. But just to evoke the story of this place, I had to space them out, so I'm just trying to go a little bit easier than usual. I'm mostly using this shanty pack, mostly for the metal roofs, because I really like that aesthetic right here next to the water. If you have a metal roof, it's going to get pretty weathered, so I like that look. And it just serves to amp up the contrast between this area and Sunrise Harbor. I do wish I had sprinkled in more of the distinctively Puerto Rican houses, because now that I'm looking at the area on Google Maps, there are quite a few of those, and less of these kinds of houses. But I think the aerial view that we get of this at the end is worth it, even though it's not quite as authentic as I'd like. Touching on that, one thing that I noticed I was like subconsciously doing while I was playing the game is I had these tests that I was comparing my build against. And there were kind of like different aspects to this. So there was the street level test where like if I zoom in and look at the street level, does it look realistic? And I found that I was usually like disappointed in that result. And then the second kind of test was, does it look like San Juan? Does it look like the area I'm taking inspiration from? And that can kind of go one way or the other. Recently, I think I've been doing a bit better of a job of following the inspiration and kind of paying more attention to the details of the real life places that I'm trying to take inspiration from. And then there's kind of the wide view test. Does this look like a real city, or does this look like the kind of city I want to make? And that one's usually pretty easy to satisfy because I've just played this game so much over the years that I'm kind of able to make something fairly realistic, and it usually is in line with what I want, even though it never turns out exactly like I imagine it. But recently I've been trying to just be more aware of like these subconscious tests that I'm doing. Because when I'm not aware of them, it can be kind of discouraging if I like zoom in and it just doesn't look exactly like I want it to. And then I either have to spend hours and hours like working on the same spot and not really having fun most times when I do that kind of thing, or I just have to, you know, move on and kind of like brood about it or whatever. I think like as soon as I noticed that I was actually doing these things, it was pretty easy just to kind of let go of it and just be happy with what I'm able to make and what I'm able to come up with. But I have noticed that, you know, these things that I like kind of subconsciously worry about when I'm making the city, they get better as I make more episodes and do more builds. So I've just been trying not to worry about it as much. So even though there are many aspects to this build that aren't quite as authentic as I'd like them to be, or weren't quite what I imagined, I'm still just trying to enjoy the times where I zoom back and I have this like cool looking city that I've made. And I think now that I've been doing that, I've been having a lot more fun playing the game and making this series. And I mean, it's always been really fun to do this. I wouldn't do it if it wasn't fun. And when it hasn't been fun, I've stopped doing it. For this run of episodes in particular, it's just been a lot more fun and a lot more freeing to accept that, like, you know, it's not going to be perfect. It's never going to be perfect. Anyway, rant over. We're detailing the shoreline here. I wanted to have the entire shoreline of Todos Santos within reason. Obviously, there are going to be portions at like the edge of the map that we're not going to detail, but I wanted most of the shoreline in the city to be completely detailed. And obviously, if we're going to have a residential area along the waterfront, there are going to be piers and docks and that kind of stuff. Some of them are private and some of them are public access. Now, in the spirit of having this place be a bit more spread out and having some empty lots here and there, instead of just filling every single square inch with grass and trees, which is what I honestly would normally do, I have these dirt decals copied and pasted everywhere. I have them as POs just because it's a little easier to work with overlapping them and fitting them in with other things without messing them up. It's just easier that way. And then any green areas that we have left, I'm just using as a guide to place some grass. I'm not using the super dense, thick stuff yet, but we're gonna get to that in a minute. And then the rest of it, we're gonna fill in with trees. Now, normally I would cut out some of this repetitive stuff, but this time I really liked seeing this area transform from just an area of spread out houses and some empty lots into a real place where you could imagine real people live. So I think this time we're gonna let it play out. Now to finish out the episode, I built this little sports park and shopping center. It was pretty much identical to the sports park that we made back in episode 54, and I'm imagining that this was built on reclaimed industrial land to serve this town. So all that's left now is to do a quick lighting pass. So we're going to jump over to the docks, and since a lot of this is PO, we have to add our own lighting. I'm mostly just using the normal wall lights here. I forgot to delete this water pump, so I had to get rid of that. That was very confusing in the dark because I couldn't tell what it was at first. And just taking that theme all the way along here. Also adding a few of these nice orange glowy industrial looking lights. And with that, I want to thank you so much for watching this episode of Todos Santos. It was incredibly fun to make, and I hope it was at least a little bit enjoyable to watch. See you on the next one. Bye-bye.